She couldn't pay for her coffee. He stepped in. What he didn't know? She was a vanished millionaire CEO, hiding from the world. The early morning chill wrapped the small town of Mornington in a soft mist as the sun slowly began to rise behind the amber hills. At the corner of a cobblestone street lined with red maple trees stood a modest coffee shop named Willow Bean. Its windows were fogged from the warmth inside, and the comforting aroma of cinnamon, roasted beans, and vanilla beckoned people in like a silent lullaby. Inside, the cafe buzzed softly with the hum of espresso machines, clinking cups, and murmured conversations. Most tables were taken by the usual crowd. College students buried in laptops, elderly couples sipping from steaming mugs, and worn-out commuters grabbing breakfast before work. But the attention of the barista momentarily shifted when a woman stepped in, her presence quietly commanding. She looked out of place, not because she was glamorous or loud, but because there was something about her that didn't fit the casual flow of the room. She wore a long, deep blue wool coat that was slightly too thin for the cold. The coat had once been elegant, expensive even, but now the edges were frayed, and one of the buttons dangled by a thread. Her black boots were scuffed, and her hair, though clearly once carefully styled, now hung in tired waves around her face. Despite the subtle signs of hardship, her posture remained upright, dignified even, though tired. Her name was Elora Bramwood, but no one in that coffee shop knew it yet. She stood silently in line, clutching a cracked leather wallet, her fingers pale from the cold. When it was her turn, she gave a polite nod and asked in a soft, almost musical voice, "One medium cappuccino. No sugar." The young barista smiled and rang her up. "That'll be $4.75. Elora opened her wallet slowly. Inside, a single faded $20 bill peeked out behind a stack of old receipts. She hesitated. Then, without touching the cash, she pulled out a debit card and handed it over with slightly trembling fingers. The barista swiped it. Declined. There was a brief pause. He swiped it again. Still declined. Elora's lips parted slightly in confusion. Her heart started to beat faster. That can't be right," she murmured, reaching to try it herself, slipping the card into the chip reader. The screen blinked red again. A few people behind her shifted uncomfortably in line. The barista leaned forward, a touch apologetic but firm. "I'm sorry, it's not going through." Elora's face remained calm, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of panic. She reached into her wallet again, but there was no backup card, no coins. She glanced at the crumpled 20. She needed that money. She didn't know if another ATM fee would send her account into overdraft again. She bit the inside of her cheek. Behind her, a quiet voice broke through. "I got it." She turned around. A man, maybe early 30s, stood behind her wearing a dusty beige jacket, jeans smudged with motor oil, and a baseball cap pulled low over short brown curls. His face was open, kind, not polished, not rehearsed. Just real. His name was Holden Vale, though she didn't know it yet. The barista looked between them. "Add hers to mine," Holden said, placing a 5 and a few coins on the counter, "and keep the change." Elora blinked, unsure what to say. "You didn't have to," she began. He shrugged, almost embarrassed by the attention. "You looked like you needed the coffee more than I did." She held his gaze for a moment, really looked at him. His eyes were warm but tired, like someone who'd seen his share of hard days, too. Her voice softened. "Thank you." She took the cup with both hands, like it was the first warmth she'd touched in days. Without another word, she stepped away and took a seat near the window. Holden picked up his own drink and sat at the far side of the room, not trying to strike up a conversation. But as he glanced once in her direction, he saw her staring down into her cup, not drinking, just thinking, as if the foam on her cappuccino might spell out the answers to whatever storm she was carrying inside. And he didn't know it then, but this quiet act of kindness, barely costing $5, was the spark that would set into motion a story far greater than either of them could imagine. A cold wind swept through the alley behind the coffee shop as Elora stepped out, cradling the cup in her gloved hands like it held more than just caffeine, like it was a lifeline. She didn't walk far, just around the corner where the streets were quieter and fewer people could see the exhaustion etched into her face. She sat on a bench near the bus stop and pulled her coat tighter around her thin frame. She hadn't meant to let her card fail. She'd calculated everything carefully. The last deposit from her meager freelance work had cleared 3 days ago, and she hadn't touched it since. But some bank fee, or maybe an old subscription she forgot to cancel, must have drained the account without her noticing. And now, $4.75 had revealed just how far she'd fallen. A gust of wind pulled strands of her hair across her face, but she made no move to brush them away. Her mind had already left the street, the city, the cold. It was drifting through the ruins of who she used to be. Just a year ago, Elora Bramwood had been at the top, CEO of Bramion Tech, one of the fastest-growing data security firms in North America. She had risen through the ranks, not by inheritance or luck, but with sheer brilliance and brutal discipline. She was 29 when she took the reins, young, fierce, and respected in a world that didn't easily hand power to women, let alone women of color. Her office had overlooked the skyline of San Francisco. Glass walls bathed in golden sun each morning as she made decisions that shaped markets. Every Monday, her boardroom would fill with executives in tailored suits, men twice her age who once underestimated her, and now hung on her every word. She didn't smile much in those days. She didn't have to. But with power came enemies, and the most dangerous one had been the man she loved, Trayson Marlowe, her chief operating officer, her partner, her fiancé. He had been charming, ambitious, and attentive at first. They'd met during a panel at a cybersecurity summit. He'd approached her afterward with a proposition about streamlining back-end systems. That conversation turned into dinners, and eventually into trust. She let him into her company and into her heart. And that's exactly where he attacked. It started subtly, suggestions in board meetings that contradicted her decisions, late-night emergencies that pulled her away, while confidential files were quietly accessed. Then came the scandal. Trayson had manipulated financial data to create the appearance of embezzlement, pinning it on her. He erased logs, doctored spreadsheets, and planted shell accounts. The media pounced on the story. The board, desperate to preserve investor confidence, suspended her immediately. No charges were filed yet, but the court of public opinion was swift and merciless. Elora tried to fight back. She hired lawyers, cybersecurity experts, PR teams, but Trayson had buried the evidence so carefully, and her name was already stained. By the end of that brutal month, she had been ousted, bank accounts frozen, and her reputation ruined. She vanished without a word, not because she was guilty, but because no one wanted to hear the truth. The moment the scandal broke, everyone disappeared. Friends, investors, even family. Her father had called once, just once, to say, "Maybe you need to think about what you did." That was the last time she'd heard from him. Now, sitting on a metal bench with a cup of charity coffee, Elora watched a city bus roll by. She didn't wave it down. She had nowhere to go that couldn't wait. The room she rented was on the edge of town, in a sagging motel called the Elms. The wallpaper peeled. The sheets smelled like bleach. The Wi-Fi barely worked, but it had a lock, and that was more than she'd had for a while. Back in the room, she plugged in her old laptop, the one thing she'd managed to keep from the company. It was a battered machine covered in scuffs, but it had power. And within it, tucked in encrypted files she created before everything fell apart, was a single hope: evidence. Logs, time-stamped server activity, email chains, audio from a recorded meeting she was never supposed to have access to. All pieces of a puzzle she'd been trying to assemble for 11 long months. But she was missing the final key, one critical data backup that lived only on the company's secured server, now unreachable without clearance. And Trayson had made sure she'd never get it. Elora leaned back in her stiff motel chair, staring at the blinking cursor on her screen. Her reflection in the dark glass behind it was a ghost of who she once was. No makeup, no sleek bun or pressed blouse, just a woman with tired eyes and a fire deep in her chest that still hadn't gone out. She didn't know why the man at the coffee shop had helped her. Maybe he was just decent. Maybe he knew the sting of being overlooked, of falling low. But in that brief moment, when he handed her the cup without asking for anything in return, something inside her had shifted, just slightly. For the first time in a long time, someone saw her not as a headline or a scandal, not as a ghost from Wall Street, but as a person. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something she thought she'd lost forever. A way back. The next few days passed slowly, marked by quiet hours at the library and sleepless nights in her drafty motel room. Elora had fallen into a rhythm of survival. Wake early, wash with lukewarm water, dress in the same clothes, walk to the public library, and spend hours poring over old files and local freelance gigs that paid pennies. She avoided crowds, rarely made eye contact, and kept her phone powered off, still afraid of who might try to trace her. But then, one Wednesday morning, something unexpected happened. She was sitting in the corner of the library with her laptop open, the screen casting a soft blue glow over her face. Her fingers moved rapidly over the keys, editing lines of code that reconstructed an old backup file she'd retrieved weeks ago. Around her, children chattered at the storytime table, and the whir of printers filled the air. That was when she heard the voice again, low, familiar, and real. They're still working on that secret project? She looked up sharply, heart skipping before she even realized why. There he was. Holden Vale, same dusty jacket, same gentle smile. He was holding a paper coffee cup in one hand and a bag of what smelled like bacon croissants in the other. He stood a few feet away, not intruding, just showing up. Like a person might if they cared. Alora stared at him for a moment, unsure how to respond. No one in the past year had followed up with her, not unless it involved accusations or demands. She swallowed before answering. Still trying to win the Nobel Prize in suffering, yeah. Holden chuckled, then raised the bag slightly. I brought reinforcements. Thought you might need breakfast. She hesitated. Her instincts screamed to keep everyone at a distance, but she also hadn't eaten properly in 2 days. And something about his presence wasn't suffocating. It was safe. You always feed women who can't pay for coffee? She asked, arching an eyebrow. Only the ones who look like they haven't slept since the Bush administration, he said without missing a beat. A ghost of a smile flickered on her lips. She gestured to the chair beside her, and he sat. They ate in silence at first. Croissants warm and flaky, coffee surprisingly decent. She kept her screen angled away from him, though, and he didn't pry. Instead, he pulled out a small paperback novel and flipped it open, just content to share the space. After a few minutes, she spoke again, softly, cautiously. You really want to know what I'm working on? Holden looked up from his book, one brow raised. Only if you want to tell me. Alora studied his face, searching for any sign of judgment, pity, or curiosity that came with strings attached. She found none, so she turned the laptop slightly toward him. On the screen was a spreadsheet filled with numbers, IP addresses, timestamps, and log files, unreadable to anyone unfamiliar with back-end server data. But Alora knew every line by heart. This is the record of a digital breach that never made it to the media, she said. It happened about a month before I was accused of corporate theft. A very specific set of data was accessed, copied, and hidden, right before someone used it to frame me. Holden leaned in a little, his face serious now. So you were framed. You weren't guessing. I knew it the moment it happened. But proving it? That's the hard part. She pointed to a line of code. This is my only thread. If I can follow it far enough, it leads to a backup server that holds the original logs before they were altered. But you don't have access to that server anymore. She shook her head. It's locked inside Bramian headquarters, high-level biometric access. Even if I could physically get there, I'd need someone on the inside. And they've all turned their backs on me. Holden looked down at the rows of data, then at her tired eyes. And why are you showing this to me? Because, she said slowly, you're the only person who hasn't asked for anything in return. The moment hung between them, quiet, full of tension, but also something warmer, a fragile trust forming in the open air of a quiet library. Holden leaned back, folding his arms. I'm not a hacker or a lawyer or whatever genius you probably need. I change spark plugs for a living. But you listen, she replied. He smiled at that, then tapped the edge of the screen lightly. If this leads where you think it does, and you get your hands on those files, what then? They magically believe you? No, she said flatly. But they won't have a choice. He watched her for a long second. You're not just trying to clear your name, he said. You're trying to burn him down. Wouldn't you? Holden's smile faded, replaced by a flicker of something darker. Something that said yes, he understood that kind of pain, that kind of betrayal. They didn't say much else that morning, but before he left, Holden turned to her and said, You ever need someone to drive the getaway car? I've got a truck and no felony record. Yet. Alora chuckled softly, a sound she hadn't made in months. She closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. Maybe she couldn't do it alone after all. But maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to. 2 nights later, the motel room was colder than usual. The aging radiator sputtered weakly. unable to push warmth through the paper-thin walls. Alora sat at the small wooden desk, hunched over her laptop, wrapped in a faded gray blanket. Her fingers, slightly trembling from the cold and fatigue, danced over the keys with precision. The only light came from the laptop screen, and a small desk lamp that flickered occasionally like it too had grown tired of fighting. Lines of code scrolled before her eyes, and with every command entered, she felt herself inching closer to the truth. But the closer she got, the more dangerous it became. She had uncovered the entry logs, proof that someone had accessed Bramian Tech's administrative systems at 3:42 a.m. on a night when she'd been 2,000 miles away on a speaking engagement. She had photos, flight records, witnesses, but none of it mattered without the key file, the server backup that showed who had done it. And that file was locked inside the company's Level 3 vault system, under biometric control. Her access had been revoked the day she was suspended. Without it, she couldn't even get past the lobby. She leaned back in her chair and rubbed her temples, the pressure behind her eyes growing heavier with each passing day. Then, as if summoned by her exhaustion, a knock came at the door. She froze. No one ever knocked on her door, not at this motel. Carefully, she stepped toward the door and looked through the peephole. It was Holden. She opened the door slowly. He stood in the hallway holding 2 steaming paper bags and a 6-pack of bottled root beer. "Didn't know if you'd eaten," he said simply. "Figured you hadn't." She stepped aside without speaking and let him in. The room was small. Just a narrow bed, a desk, a half-working lamp, and a clutter of files and old ramen containers. Holden glanced around, saying nothing, but she felt the silent weight of his observation. He placed the food on the desk and pulled up the only other chair. "You work too hard," he said, handing her a warm container of chicken and rice. "I don't have the luxury of sleep," she murmured, unwrapping the plastic fork. They ate in silence for a moment, the sound of the wind rattling the motel window behind them. Finally, Holden set his bottle down. "So, what's the next step?" Elora paused, food halfway to her mouth. "You really want to be involved in this?" "Look," he said, leaning forward, "I don't know code. I don't know tech companies or biometric firewalls or legal battles. But I do know what it feels like when someone you trusted burns your life down. And I know what it's like to fight like hell just to stay upright." She stared at him, eyes wide with the kind of raw vulnerability that most people never saw in her. "Who betrayed you?" she asked. Holden let out a slow breath. "My brother, Gage. He got caught stealing catalytic converters. I bailed him out. He promised me he'd stop. I even vouched for him when he applied for work. Then, he robbed my shop and disappeared with half my tools. Left me to explain it to the cops and our mother." He paused, staring at the worn floor. "I told myself I'd never trust anyone again after that. But here I am." Alora swallowed the lump in her throat, and I told myself I didn't deserve help after letting my guard down with Trayson. "Maybe we're both terrible at self-preservation," he offered with a tired smile. She reached for her laptop and opened a new window, her voice low and firm. "I need to get inside Bramian Tech headquarters. Not just the lobby, the sub-level vault. That's where the backup server is. If I can access it, I can prove everything." Holden looked skeptical, but not dismissive. "And how do you plan to do that?" "I designed part of the building myself. Security layout, emergency protocols, access points. I know there's a maintenance entrance on the north side that's connected to the HVAC tunnels. It's used only during system servicing, and it's not monitored by standard security after midnight." "You're planning a heist?" Holden asked, eyes widening slightly. "Like an actual break-in?" "Not a break-in," she corrected. "A retrieval. I have a right to that file. It was created under my authorization. Legally, it's still connected to my digital signature. But physically getting to it is still illegal, right?" She hesitated. "Let's just say morally legal. Maybe not technically." Holden ran a hand through his hair. "You've got nerve, Alora. You really think you can get in and out without being caught?" "I don't have another choice." He leaned back, considering everything she'd said. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. "Okay, let's do it." She blinked. "You're serious?" "As a heart attack. I've got tools, a work truck, and a knack for squeezing into tight spaces. If you're going, I'm going." Alora's lips parted slightly, surprised, not by his ability, but by the simple loyalty behind his words. "Why would you risk that? For me?" Holden shrugged. "Because someone once said I was just a mechanic. I want to prove them wrong. And because you deserve a second chance." Same way I wish someone had given one to me. For a long moment, they sat in silence. Not awkward, not heavy. Just the kind of silence that comes when two people realize they're no longer entirely alone. Finally, Alora reached for her notepad and started sketching the floor plan of the building. We'll go Saturday night, midnight. You'll need gloves, a black hoodie, and absolute silence. Holden chuckled. You know, for a former CEO, you make a surprisingly convincing criminal. Elora looked up, her expression serious, but laced with something new. Hope. I'm not trying to steal anything, she said quietly. I'm just trying to take back what he stole from me. And as she went back to outlining the plan, with Holden beside her reviewing every detail like it was life or death, she realized something important. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about rebuilding what had been broken, one piece at a time. Saturday night fell over Mornington with a hush. The town's small streets grew still as porch lights blinked off one by one, and a pale silver moon hung low over the horizon, casting soft light on the rooftops. Alora stood in front of the mirror in her motel bathroom, dressed in all black. A thick hoodie, slim-fit pants, dark gloves. Her hair was pulled tightly back and tucked under a black beanie. She didn't look like the woman she used to be. No designer heels, no power suit, no gleaming conference room behind her. She looked like a shadow, quiet, sharp, and dangerous. A knock at the door made her jump slightly. 3 quick raps, exactly as they'd agreed. She opened it to find Holden dressed similarly, except his hoodie bore a faded logo for a racing team and his hands were in his pockets. Over his shoulder, he carried a compact black backpack filled with tools. Flashlights, wire cutters, thermal tape, and even an old electrician's badge he'd found in his garage. You ready? He asked. Alora nodded, exhaling slowly. Let's go. They drove in silence. The streets were empty, the town asleep, and as the truck rolled toward the outskirts, toward the glass and steel behemoth that was the Bramian Tech headquarters, Alora felt the tight grip of memory creeping into her chest. It had been almost a year since she last saw that building in person. She remembered walking out through its massive revolving doors in shame, cameras flashing, reporters shouting, her resignation forced into her hands like a sentence. Now, she was returning not as an executive, but as an infiltrator. They parked a few blocks away on the backside of a commercial plaza. From there, they moved on foot, keeping to the shadows, ducking behind hedges and dumpsters, skirting security cameras mounted on poles. Holden moved confidently beside her, his footsteps light, his breath steady. Finally, they reached the north maintenance wall. The HVAC panel was hidden behind a steel mesh gate, locked but rusted around the edges. Alora knelt down, pulling a folded blueprint from inside her coat. She studied it briefly, then whispered, Here, this is it. Holden knelt beside her and took out a small crowbar and flashlight. It took him less than 2 minutes to wedge the mesh gate open, and another minute to unscrew the outer panel. Behind it, a narrow shaft led into the belly of the building. Not exactly OSHA compliant, he muttered. Alora slid in first, crawling on her elbows, the metal cold against her chest. The tunnel was tight and dark, the air stale with dust and machine oil. Holden followed behind, passing her small tools as needed. She led them through a narrow crawl space that eventually opened into a service chamber. From there, they dropped silently into an empty storage corridor just outside the server vault. Motion sensors blinked dimly along the walls. Stay still, she whispered, until the cycle resets. It takes 10 seconds. They waited. The blinking paused. A brief window. They moved like ghosts, slipping past the sensors and into the small entry alcove where a biometric scanner blinked blue, awaiting authorization. This is the part where most people would turn back, Holden murmured. Alora pulled a small device from her coat, an encrypted biometric duplicator. She had spent months modifying it with salvaged firmware and fragments of her original access code. It wasn't perfect, but it had one shot. She placed her thumb on it, waited for the device to calibrate, then pressed it gently against the scanner. The light turned red, then flickered, then green. The door clicked softly. They were in. Inside, the room was a marvel of cold engineering. Racks of servers blinked with rows of green and blue lights, humming softly in the silence. The room was chilled to preserve the hardware, and mist hung in the air near the ceiling. Alora's breath caught in her throat. I built this room, she whispered. I designed every inch of it. Holden looked around, slightly awed. You were CEO of this? She gave a bitter smile. Yeah, before they ripped it all away. She approached the main access terminal and plugged in her laptop. It was time. The machine booted up, and Alora's fingers flew over the keys. She bypassed the standard OS, launched her own secure interface, and initiated a direct query. Searching for backup root logs, she whispered, more to herself than to Holden. Holden stood by the door, listening for any sounds beyond the vault. His eyes kept flicking toward the hallway, adrenaline tightening in his chest. Then he turned to glance back at Alora and froze. On the security screen above her laptop, a small red dot blinked. Elora, he said, voice low but urgent. Someone just logged into the external system. She whipped around. A second screen had activated. A remote user attempting to access the security feed. Someone else was watching. Her breath caught. It's him. Holden didn't need to ask who. Trayson Marlowe. Elora didn't hesitate. She accelerated the download process, forcing the system into overdrive. The fans inside the mainframe began to whir louder as her laptop pulled encrypted archives from the secured folders. Come on, she muttered. Come on. A minute passed, then another. Extraction complete, the screen finally read. She yanked the USB out of her laptop and shoved it into her pocket. We have it. Let's go. Alarms hadn't triggered yet, but the system was hot, and they both knew it was only a matter of time. They moved fast, retracing their steps, sliding back through the maintenance corridor and into the night air. Once they were back in the truck, hearts pounding and clothes soaked in sweat despite the cold, Elora finally allowed herself a breath of relief. Holden was grinning as he started the engine. Tell me that was worth it. She clutched the USB tightly in her palm, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and hope. It was everything. And as they drove off into the darkness, neither of them noticed the security camera above the north exit, slowly rotating back toward its original position, its last recording already flagged for executive review. The morning after the break-in, Elora sat cross-legged on the motel bed. The USB drive clenched so tightly in her palm that the edges had left small marks in her skin. Her heart was still pounding, not from fear, but from anticipation. The weight of the truth she had carried for a year now had finally taken shape in something real, something solid. And now, it sat inside a tiny metal stick, no longer than her finger. Holden was across the room, nursing a cup of cheap motel coffee and watching her with cautious concern. He hadn't said much since they'd returned a few hours earlier, but the adrenaline had faded from his eyes, replaced by something more grounded, protective, watchful. Elora exhaled slowly and plugged the USB into her laptop. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the directory opened, rows of files unfurling like the unraveling of a locked vault. She clicked through the folders, bypassing encryption one layer at a time, until she reached what she had been seeking for nearly 12 months. The unedited server logs from the night of the data breach. Full access metadata. Raw signatures. Time-stamped user IDs, and there it was. User, T. Marlowe. 3:42 a.m. Location, Executive Terminal, Server Room. B. Access type. Override with forged admin clearance. Files downloaded. Financial audit structures. Employee payroll branches. Security clearance protocols. Her breath hitched as she read through the confirmation line after line. He hadn't even been subtle. Trayson had used his position as COO to override her security parameters, breach the system from within, and alter financial pathways to mimic theft. He framed her cleanly and efficiently. No trace, until now. Elora stared at the screen, her hands trembling. For so long, she had begun to doubt herself, to wonder if she had missed something, miscalculated, or maybe hadn't been as careful as she thought. But this was proof. Cold, precise, undeniable. Holden set his coffee down and came to stand behind her. That's it, isn't it? She nodded, blinking back tears. That's everything. Then what's the next move? Elora wiped her face and turned in her chair. Now, we expose him. She didn't want a press conference. She didn't want social media posts or flashy accusations. What she wanted, what she needed, was institutional acknowledgement. For the board who had thrown her out, for the prosecutors who ignored her pleas, for the friends who ghosted her. To see the facts laid bare. And there was only one way to do that. I'm going to the district attorney's office, she said firmly. I'll bring the raw data, the full logs, all of it. They'll have no choice but to investigate. Holden frowned. You think they'll listen after all this time? They won't have a choice, she replied, especially once they see what I've got. There are federal violations buried in that breach. Data privacy laws, securities fraud. It's more than just me now. It's a crime that affects shareholders, employees, maybe even national infrastructure contracts. Holden gave a low whistle. You don't aim small, huh? No, she said softly. I never did. Still, they both knew the path ahead wouldn't be smooth. Trayson was powerful, connected, and ruthless. And if he sensed what she was about to do, he wouldn't hesitate to strike first. That's when her burner phone buzzed for the first time in weeks. She stiffened and reached for it cautiously. No caller ID, just a single text message. You should have stayed gone. Her blood ran cold. She showed the phone to Holden. He stared at it for a long second before speaking. He knows. Elora nodded, locking the phone. I expected this. Holden stepped closer. Then you're not going alone. I can't ask you to... You didn't ask. I'm telling you. For a few seconds, she just looked at him, really looked at him. A man who had every reason to walk away, who had no stake in her war, except that he chose to make it his own. And in that silence, she felt something she hadn't felt in over a year. The fragile strength that came from knowing someone had your back. They packed quickly. Elora backed up the files on a second USB and stored it in her shoe, just in case. She printed out several hard copies of the key logs and tucked them into a manila folder. Holden brought his truck around and they drove toward the county courthouse just after noon, keeping to quiet roads and watching every vehicle in the rearview mirror. Downtown Mornington was busier than usual for a Saturday. Street vendors were setting up for a local fair, and foot traffic buzzed in every direction. It gave them just enough cover to move unnoticed. They walked into the courthouse lobby and passed through the metal detectors. Elora felt like her heart might burst as the guards waved them through. At the reception desk for the district attorney's office, she handed over her ID, which still bore her title as CEO, though most people assumed it had been revoked. I need to speak to someone regarding a corporate security breach, she said calmly. This pertains to federal crimes involving financial manipulation and executive fraud. The receptionist's expression changed. Do you have an appointment? No, she said, her voice tightening, but I have evidence. Holden stepped up beside her and placed a USB on the counter. And trust me, you're going to want to see it. The woman looked between them, hesitated, then picked up the phone. 20 minutes later, they were sitting in a private interview room. A young assistant DA, a woman named Sierra Maddox, entered with a legal pad and a cautious expression. You've got 15 minutes, she said. Convince me it matters. Elora opened her folder, slid the documents across the table, and took a breath. And then, calm, focused, steady, she began to speak. As her voice filled the room, breaking down what had happened, who had done it, and how it had nearly destroyed her life, Sierra Maddox stopped writing. By the end of the hour, she wasn't taking notes anymore. She was staring at Elora, and then she whispered, This could take down an empire. Elora folded her hands. No, she said. It'll take down a man who thought he was one. The days that followed were a whirlwind of movement and silence, of tense phone calls and long stretches of waiting. Elora remained hidden in a private safe house, provided discreetly by the district attorney's office, tucked away on the outskirts of Mornington. It was a modest place, bare walls, a single bed, blackout curtains, but it offered something she hadn't had in months: protection. Outside the public eye, a storm was gathering. After reviewing the evidence Elora submitted, Assistant District Attorney Sierra Maddox immediately escalated the case. It turned out Sierra had long suspected corruption within Bramian Tech, but she'd never had access to anything concrete, until now. Elora's data opened doors to not only Trayson Marlowe's crimes, but a broader network of financial misconduct involving offshore accounts, falsified audits, and unreported bonuses issued to select board members. An internal investigation was launched in secret. Federal agents were called in. The Department of Justice began preliminary inquiries. Within 48 hours, subpoenas were drafted, encrypted messages were decrypted, and one by one, key names from Bramion's upper echelons began to surface. Trayson, of course, was at the center of it all. He knew it too. On the morning of the third day, Elora was sipping tea in the kitchen of the safe house when the television, which had been left on quietly in the corner, suddenly caught her attention. A breaking news banner flashed across the screen. Bramion coup Trayson Marlowe under federal investigation. Her cup paused halfway to her mouth. The news anchor's voice was clipped and urgent. According to a statement from the Assistant District Attorney's Office, a formal investigation is now underway into Tech's financial leadership, following the emergence of new evidence involving cybersecurity breaches, executive fraud, and attempted obstruction of justice. No formal charges have yet been filed, but sources confirm subpoenas have been issued, and offices are being searched. Elora stood still, unable to tear her eyes from the screen. They'd actually done it. The door creaked open behind her. Holden walked in, wearing an old flannel and holding a toolbox. He'd spent the morning replacing the lock on the front door himself, unable to relax, knowing she was still vulnerable. "You saw it?" he asked softly. She nodded. "Everything's in motion now," she said, voice distant. Holden sat down beside her and opened the toolbox. Not to work, but to retrieve a small velvet pouch he had placed inside the night before. He handed it to her without a word. She opened it slowly, confused. Inside was a keychain. Simple. Silver. Attached to it was a tiny engraved plate that read, "To building again. H." Her fingers trembled as she held it. "I know you don't need anyone to save you," he said. But sometimes you deserve someone to stand with you while you do the saving." She looked up at him, eyes glassy. "You didn't have to. I wanted to." He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, gently. "I've watched you claw your way back from the edge, Elora. Not for revenge, for truth, for dignity. If you think this ends with Marlowe, you're wrong." She tilted her head. "What do you mean?" He smiled faintly. "It ends with you sitting across a boardroom table again, with your name on the door, with people remembering exactly who you are." Her throat tightened. She looked away briefly to hide how deeply his words struck. But it wasn't over yet. That afternoon, she was summoned downtown for a private deposition. Federal agents had arrived to formally question her. She spent hours walking them through every log file, every breach, every late-night modification Trayson had made behind her back. The agents, all sharp and stone-faced, took notes furiously and asked detailed follow-up questions. By the end of the day, one of them, Agent Cordell, closed his folder and said something that chilled her spine. "You're lucky you got out when you did. You weren't just being framed. If you had stayed another month, I think they would have buried you completely." That night, after hours of questioning and file analysis, Sierra Maddox called Elora aside privately. "There's going to be a press conference," she said. "Tomorrow morning. We're naming the investigation publicly and confirming that you've been exonerated." Elora blinked. "Wait, exonerated?" Sierra smiled. "Officially. You're no longer under scrutiny. Your name will be cleared in front of every camera in the country." Elora sank into a chair, stunned. She had dreamt of this moment for months, imagined what it would feel like. But now that it was here, it felt surreal. The next morning came too fast. Downtown, beneath a sky still pale with dawn, journalists gathered in front of the courthouse steps. Microphones were set. Cameras clicked into place. Sierra Maddox took the podium and, with calm authority, announced the investigation, the evidence, and the name of the whistleblower who had made it all possible. "We owe a debt of gratitude to Miss Elora Bramwood," Sierra said clearly. "Her courage, intelligence, and commitment to justice not only brought a criminal to light, but protected the integrity of an entire institution. She was not the villain in this story. She was the key to uncovering it." The crowd erupted in questions, but Elora stood to the side, silent, watching the waves of attention crash toward her. She didn't need the spotlight, not anymore. She needed closure. That night, she and Holden walked through the quiet downtown streets of Mornington. The air was cool and smelled faintly of pine and firewood. People who recognized her glanced her way. Some nodded respectfully. Others avoided eye contact in shame. But she didn't feel bitter. She felt free. "You going back to Bramion?" Holden asked gently. She shook her head. "No, that part of my life's over. I don't want to rebuild what they destroyed. I want to build something better." Holden looked at her like she had just said the most natural thing in the world. "What do you have in mind?" She smiled. "Something that doesn't have ceilings." They stopped beneath a street lamp, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Elora looked up at the night sky without flinching. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was rising. A month later, the world had moved on, as it always does. News cycles shifted. The headlines about Trayson Marlowe's arrest were replaced with stories about stock surges and political scandals. But the echoes of what had happened still resonated in boardrooms across the country. CEOs began tightening internal audits, investors demanded transparency, and somewhere in that rising wave of reckoning, Elora Bramwood's name began to carry weight again, not as a scandal, but as a symbol. She hadn't returned to Bramian Tech. True to her word, she refused the board's invitation to rejoin in a transitional leadership role. Their offer had come wrapped in flowery apologies and strategic incentives, but Elora saw it for what it was: damage control. They didn't want her back. They wanted her silence. She gave them neither. Instead, she moved quietly, purposefully, towards something new. She and Holden had rented a small shared workspace in an old converted factory in the heart of Mornington. The walls were exposed brick, the floors polished concrete, and the air carried a scent of old paper and fresh ambition. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. She called the venture Bramvale Solutions, a hybrid think tank and data integrity firm aimed at helping small businesses protect their digital infrastructure. Not billion-dollar giants, not power-hungry conglomerates, just honest companies with honest missions, something Elora had longed for and never had in the high-rise jungle of corporate warfare. Holden, of course, was beside her every step of the way. He wasn't a tech expert, and he never pretended to be. But his instincts, his loyalty, and his innate understanding of people made him the soul of the operation. He helped set up the office, repaired the leaky pipes, and even built the conference table by hand from reclaimed wood. His hands were rough, but his presence had become something Elora depended on more than she was ready to admit aloud. One late afternoon, Elora stood at that hand-built table, reviewing a new partnership contract. The light poured in from the warehouse windows, painting golden rectangles across the floor. Outside, birds sang the last notes of day. Holden walked in with a pair of mismatched mugs, one for her, one for him. "You've been staring at that paper for 20 minutes, he said, handing her tea. "Is it written in Latin?" She chuckled, took a sip. "No, it's just real. It's happening. Every part of this is mine, ours." He leaned against the table. "How does it feel?" She paused, then looked up at him with something soft in her expression. "Like breathing again, like after holding your breath for years." He nodded slowly. "You earned that breath, Elora." They stood in silence for a moment before she reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. It was addressed to her in bold, expensive handwriting. Holden raised an eyebrow. "Now, more boardroom drama?" "No," she said with a sly smile. "From Sierra Maddox." She opened it and unfolded the letter. Inside was a formal invitation to speak at a national tech ethics conference in D.C. She had been asked to deliver the keynote address on whistleblower protections and corporate accountability. The event would be broadcast live, high-profile, political, bold. Elora's hands trembled slightly as she reread the letter. Holden watched her. "You gonna do it?" "I think I have to." "Scared?" She looked at him honestly. "Terrified." He smiled. "That means it's worth it." The night before the flight, she visited her old motel one last time. Room 6B, the place where she'd stayed hidden, where she'd cried into cold sheets and written code on a flickering laptop, daring to hope for justice. She didn't go inside. She just stood outside the door, letting the wind ruffle her coat, and whispered a quiet thank you to the woman she had been back then. The woman who refused to give up, even when the world told her to disappear. The next day, she stood at a podium in Washington. Her image beamed onto screens across the country. She wore a dark navy blazer, hair pinned up neatly, the engraved keychain Holden had given her clipped discreetly to her bag. She didn't read from notes. She didn't need to. Her voice was clear, strong. "I was told to disappear, to stay silent, to carry the shame of a crime I didn't commit. But the truth has a pulse. It breathes. And if you wait long enough, it fights its way to the surface. What happened to me could happen to any of us. But it doesn't have to, if we choose to build better." Applause thundered through the auditorium. Some rose to their feet. Others wiped away tears. Elora didn't cry. She stood tall and steady, eyes fixed on the future. When she returned to Mornington 2 days later, Holden was waiting at the airport with flowers, wild ones, not roses, and a thermos of her favorite coffee. "I watched the whole thing," he said as they walked to his truck. "You looked like the woman in the blueprint photo above that vault room, but stronger." She smiled. I am stronger. They drove back through quiet roads, the sun dipping low. That evening, sitting on the roof of their office building under a blanket of stars, Alora leaned her head on Holden's shoulder. She had been framed, humiliated, cast aside, but she had found truth, found herself, and found someone who stood beside her when it mattered most. And though the world had tried to break her, she had rebuilt, brick by brick, line by line. This time, it wasn't about power, it was about peace, and she had never felt more free. In my view, the ending of this story is not just satisfying, it's necessary. Alora's journey represents a rare kind of arc, one that doesn't seek revenge, but reclamation. She doesn't simply get back what was taken, she transforms her pain into purpose. That's the quiet triumph of the finale. What I admire most is how the story resists the easy path. It doesn't give Elora a clean, heroic return to her old throne at Bramian. Instead, it honors her growth by showing that real healing often comes from letting go of what broke you and building something new with your own hands. And in her case, with Holden's steady presence beside her. Holden, too, is more than a romantic subplot. He represents grounded strength, proof that love, when it's born from friendship and forged in truth, doesn't save you but walks beside you as you save yourself. In the end, Elora doesn't win because she exposed a villain. She wins because she redefined what victory meant, and in doing so, she became not a survivor of betrayal, but a builder of something bigger than revenge, dignity, purpose, and real freedom. That, to me, is the most powerful kind of ending.